They said I was nothing, a fragile ornament, a woman lucky enough to marry into their empire. On my wedding night, my mother-in-law leaned in close, her perfume sharp and suffocating, and whispered, "You'll never make it." I smiled, said nothing, and let them believe I was small. For years, I played the role they cast me in, silent, invisible, disposable. But silence is not weakness, it is strategy. And invisibility? That is power. Because when you're underestimated long enough, you learn to move in the shadows. And one day, when the spotlight shifts, it blinds them, not you. The night of my wedding felt like a scene stolen from a magazine. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in golden light. Violins hummed in the background, and every corner of the room smelled faintly of roses. Guests clinked champagne glasses, congratulating my husband and his family for what they called the perfect union. To them, I was an accessory, an elegant mannequin dressed in white silk. My gown shimmered under the lights, flawless to the eyes of strangers, yet to me it felt like armor, heavy and suffocating. I smiled until my cheeks ached, holding my husband's arm as if we were equals, but the truth was already beginning to show in the way his mother's eyes lingered on me, measuring, dissecting. She was a woman born to command rooms. Her diamonds caught the light like weapons, her laughter sharp and deliberate, the kind that told everyone she was untouchable. She pulled me close, her hand cool against mine, and whispered into my ear, "You'll never make it." The words sank into my chest like ice water. I forced my lips to curve, but my fingers trembled beneath the silk. It was the first crack in the illusion, the moment the perfect paradise began to dissolve. The weeks that followed confirmed what my gut already knew. My access to money disappeared almost overnight. Joint accounts became locked. Every purchase I made was questioned. "It's for your own good," my husband said, his tone casual, dismissive, as though I were a child asking for candy. His mother's instructions came through him like commandments: what to wear, how to behave, when to speak. I was given a credit card with a limit so small it felt like a leash. At family dinners, I was placed at the far end of the table, tasked with pouring wine, clearing plates, making polite conversation only when spoken to. At first, I thought my husband would defend me. I waited for him to look at me across the table, to roll his eyes at his mother's cruelty, to squeeze my hand under the tablecloth. Instead, he looked away. Sometimes, worse, he smirked. It dawned on me that silence wasn't complicity. It was alignment. He believed her. To him, I wasn't a partner. I was a liability, a decoration, a mistake he could control. The humiliation came in waves, subtle enough that no outsider would notice, but sharp enough to bruise my spirit. A guest at a charity gala asked if I worked, and before I could answer, my mother-in-law leaned in with a smile. "She doesn't need to. She has us." Laughter erupted around the table. I lowered my gaze, pretending to laugh with them, while inside I was breaking. But breaking is only half the story. What they didn't understand was that every cruel word, every smirk, every restriction was fuel. I listened, I observed, and I remembered. It was during one of those suffocating dinners that I overheard the conversation that would change everything. My sister-in-law, glowing with excitement, leaned across the table to announce her engagement. The family erupted in cheers, champagne glasses raised once again. My mother-in-law's pride radiated like a spotlight as she described the wedding they were planning, something grander than anything the city had seen in years. "We've already booked the venue," she declared, her eyes glittering with triumph. $10 million, the most exclusive space in town, only the best for our daughter. The words hung in the air, and something inside me shifted. My heart beat faster, not from jealousy, but from recognition. I knew that venue, intimately. I had walked its marble floors, reviewed its blueprints, signed the contracts that made it possible, because it wasn't just a venue, it was mine. The room buzzed with excitement, but their voices faded into a dull hum in my ears. My gaze lingered on my mother-in-law, her face lit with satisfaction as if she had secured her throne for another generation. My husband looked at her with the same worshipful eyes he once turned on me. They had no idea that every step they were taking toward this wedding was a step into my world. I pressed my lips together to hide the smallest of smiles. For years, they had built walls around me, convinced I would remain trapped. But the ground beneath their fortress was shifting, and they couldn't hear it. Yet, that night, as I removed the heavy gown from my shoulders, I stared at my reflection. The woman in the mirror no longer looked fragile. Her eyes burned with something colder, sharper. They thought they knew who I was. They thought they had written the ending for me. But I was only just beginning. And when the day came that their empire tried to shine brighter than mine, they would discover that the stage they stood on, the very ground beneath their feet, belonged to me. I learned quickly that survival in that house meant silence, so I played the role they wrote for me. I lowered my gaze when my mother-in-law corrected me in front of the staff, bowed my head when my sister-in-law boasted about her designer gowns, and smiled faintly when my husband brushed off my questions with a curt, "Don't worry about it." I let them believe I was shrinking, powerless, grateful just to be in their orbit. The truth was, invisibility had become my shield. While they reveled in their triumphs, I watched. I memorized every glance, every whispered insult, every careless mistake. They mistook my quiet for weakness, and I let them. At charity events, I played the dutiful wife, standing just far enough behind my husband to remind everyone that I was secondary. I poured drinks, laughed when expected, and nodded when my mother-in-law flaunted her authority. Behind that mask, though, I was listening, always listening. One evening, when the house had gone still, I wandered into the study. The air smelled faintly of leather and aged whiskey, the heavy curtains muffling the city lights beyond. Papers were strewn across the mahogany desk, left behind after yet another planning session for the grand wedding. My fingers hovered over the stack, my heart pounding. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew the cameras in the corners would catch me, but curiosity was stronger than fear. I pulled the top sheet closer. It was a contract, crisp, embossed, heavy with importance. My eyes scanned the lines and then froze. There it was, a deposit slip, $10 million. My breath caught in my throat. The venue they had been bragging about, the crown jewel of the city's social scene. I knew every inch of that place. I knew because I had built it. The study spun around me, but my mind was clear, sharper than it had been in years. They thought they had me caged, but I had been holding the key all along. I closed the folder, slid it neatly back into place, and walked out with steady steps. On the surface, I was still the obedient daughter-in-law, the woman who never spoke out of turn. But inside, the fire had been lit. It hadn't always been this way. Years ago, long before I met my husband, I had tried to build something of my own, a small company, a dream born out of late nights and empty bank accounts. I poured everything into it, savings, time, even friendships I should have protected. And then, in one brutal year, it all collapsed. Investors pulled out, debt swallowed me, and people who once called me visionary began to whisper words like failure and fool. I remember standing outside a courthouse with papers in my hand, feeling the weight of the world pressing me into the ground. But rock bottom is a strange place. It either breaks you or it builds you into something unrecognizable. I chose the latter. I worked in silence, away from the judgmental eyes, away from the people who enjoyed watching me fall. I studied markets, learned real estate from the ground up, partnered with people who valued grit over pedigree. Slowly, brick by brick, I built again. This time, I didn't put my name on the front door. I became the ghost investor, the silent architect, the shadow behind the curtain. And when the opportunity came to buy into a chain of luxury venues, I didn't hesitate. The numbers made sense, but more than that, it felt like destiny. I signed the contracts with steady hands, remembering every insult, every smirk, every whispered, "You'll never make it." I didn't need recognition then. All I needed was ownership, power in its quietest, sharpest form. Now, as I stared at that deposit slip with my mother-in-law's name on it, the irony almost made me laugh. They were paying me, unknowingly, to host their grandest event. The very empire they used to humiliate me would soon stand on a foundation I had built. The next morning, I attended breakfast as usual, pouring coffee into porcelain cups, smiling faintly at their chatter. Inside, though, I carried a secret heavier than any insult they could throw at me. When my sister-in-law gushed about the chandeliers that would hang above her dance floor, I pictured the invoice with my signature. When my mother-in-law boasted about exclusivity, I thought of the boardroom where every executive bowed their head when I entered. A week later, I walked into that same boardroom. Men in tailored suits rose to their feet, their voices respectful, their eyes waiting for my approval. On the table before me lay the final approval papers for the wedding. My fingers brushed the pen, and for a moment I closed my eyes. I remembered the sting of her words. "You'll never make it." I remembered the laughter at my expense, the years of being treated like furniture in my own home. And then I signed. One stroke of ink, one silent act, and the game shifted entirely. They thought they were in control, but from that moment on, every step they took toward their shining day was one step deeper into my world. I became indispensable to them by pretending to be invisible. The wedding consumed every conversation, every meal, every waking thought in that house. My mother-in-law spoke of floral arrangements that would outshine royalty. My sister-in-law gushed about her diamond tiara, and my husband nodded dutifully, as if orchestrating a coronation. I sat quietly at the edge of their empire, nodding, smiling, and offering to help with whatever task they deemed too menial for themselves. They handed me to-do lists filled with errands: confirm the caterer, pick up fabric swatches, count place cards. I obeyed with enthusiasm, playing the part of the eager, unimportant wife. When my sister-in-law scoffed, "At least you're finally being useful," I only smiled, handing her a tray of samples as though I hadn't caught the venom in her tone. When my mother-in-law dismissed my opinion with a wave of her jeweled hand, I lowered my eyes, letting her bask in her authority. Every insult, every dismissal only tightened the net I was weaving around them. They believed I was harmless, incapable of more than running errands and smiling politely. That was my greatest weapon. The more they underestimated me, the less they looked behind the curtain. At night, when the house was quiet, I studied their plans in detail. Guest lists that read like a directory of the city's elite. Performers flown in from Europe, dinners priced higher than cars. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a stage. My mother-in-law wanted to cement her family's reputation as untouchable, the dynasty everyone envied. But dynasties fall hardest when the foundation cracks beneath them. The day of the rehearsal dinner, I was handed a list of seating charts to finalize. My sister-in-law, drunk on champagne and attention, laughed at me when I accidentally smudged ink across one of the place cards. "Maybe next time you'll learn to be careful," she sneered, her friends snickering. I kept my head bowed, cheeks flushing with practiced embarrassment. Inside, I was already picturing the moment their laughter would catch in their throats. 2 nights later, I walked into a boardroom 30 floors above the city. The view stretched endlessly across towers and lights, but all eyes in the room were fixed on me. Men in dark suits rose from their chairs the instant I entered. "Good evening, Madam Carter," they greeted in unison, their voices respectful, their faces solemn. The title settled over me like a second skin, one I had been wearing in secret for years. I sat at the head of the table, unfolded the contract for the upcoming wedding, and listened as my executives detailed preparations. Security, staffing, logistics, every aspect of the event was under our control. The family believed they were orchestrating perfection. In truth, they were guests in my house, performers on my stage. I ran my fingers over the embossed cover of the contract. My name was etched there, not as an afterthought, but as authority. For a moment I closed my eyes and remembered the sting of my mother-in-law's words. "You'll never make it." She had no idea she had already stepped into the empire she swore I'd never build. When I left the boardroom that night, the city below glowed like a constellation. Power didn't need to shout. Power didn't need to be announced. It simply existed, steady and undeniable. Back in the mansion, the rehearsals grew louder. My mother-in-law paraded through the halls with designers trailing behind her, pointing at swatches and nodding at sketches. She didn't notice how my hands no longer trembled when I carried her tea. She didn't see the quiet smile tugging at my lips when she bragged about how the world would envy her family. My husband barely looked at me anymore. His loyalty was cemented to his mother's shadow. It didn't matter. Soon his shadow would vanish. The wedding invitations were printed and delivered within weeks. White envelopes sealed with gold wax, the kind of luxury that demanded respect before it was even opened. I waited until I was alone before I slit one open, letting the thick cardstock slide into my hands. The letters gleamed under the light, bold and proud. Names, dates, a promise of opulence. But what caught my eye wasn't the calligraphy or the crest embossed at the top. It was the line printed in small, perfect type at the bottom. Venue owned by Emily Carter. The words pulsed against the page, louder than any insult, sharper than any whisper. For years they had silenced me, diminished me, erased me. Now, with a single line on a wedding invitation, my name stood taller than theirs. Every guest who opened that envelope would see it. Every socialite, every magnate, every rival. My mother-in-law had spent millions to elevate her daughter. But in doing so, she had written my name into history. I folded the cards slowly, savoring the moment. The game they thought they were winning was already over. They just didn't know it yet. The day of the wedding dawned beneath a flawless sky. The venue shimmered like a palace. Ivory columns, marble floors gleaming under crystal chandeliers, and an endless sea of roses filling the air with sweetness. Guests arrived in sleek cars, stepping out in gowns that glimmered like jewels, their laughter echoing through the courtyard. To the world, it was the pinnacle of elegance. To my mother-in-law, it was proof that her dynasty was untouchable. She floated through the crowd, chin high, basking in admiration. My sister-in-law radiated smug satisfaction. Every step she took rehearsed for maximum attention. And I stayed in the background just as they expected, a silent silhouette in a corner. I could feel the weight of the secret pressing against my ribs, but my face betrayed nothing. My husband glanced at me once, his expression detached, as if I were merely an afterthought. They had no idea. Not yet. The ceremony unfolded with predictable grandeur. Strings swelled, champagne flowed, and cameras flashed as society's finest documented the spectacle. My mother-in-law stood proudly at the center, orchestrating every detail, convinced she had secured the legacy she craved. She didn't notice the stage lights dimming for the announcement. She didn't hear the shift in tone as the master of ceremonies raised his voice, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone rich with reverence, "before we begin, let us honor the remarkable woman without whom tonight would not be possible. Please welcome the owner of this exquisite venue, Mrs. Emily Carter." For one suspended moment, silence consumed the room. Glasses froze mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head turned. My name, delivered with such authority, rang louder than any orchestra. And then came the sound, a single sharp shatter. My mother-in-law's crystal flute slipped from her hand and exploded against the marble floor, shards scattered at her feet, glinting under the chandelier like fallen stars. Her painted smile cracked, her breath caught in her throat. She blinked once, twice, as if hoping she had misheard. But the echo of my name lingered, undeniable. Whispers surged through the hall like a rising tide. Did he say Emily Carter? The daughter-in-law? She owns this place. Faces turned toward me, some in disbelief, others in awe. I felt the heat of 100 eyes, but I didn't flinch. I stepped forward slowly, my heels clicking against the marble, each step a drumbeat of inevitability. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply let the truth stand unadorned. My mother-in-law's empire of appearances crumbled without me lifting a finger. She had built this night to showcase her power, and instead it had become my stage. Her face drained of color. My sister-in-law clutched her fiancé's arm, her laughter dying in her throat. Even the chandelier above seemed to hum with the weight of revelation. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't silent, I was undeniable. The conversations grew louder now, a swarm of curiosity and judgment. Guests leaned toward one another, speculating, recalibrating their loyalties. Some looked at me with newfound respect, others with envy, but none with dismissal. My name had rewritten the script, and every whisper was proof. Across the room, my mother-in-law struggled to collect herself, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. The woman who once wielded diamonds like daggers now looked naked, stripped of control. I caught her gaze, and for the first time, she looked away. The destruction was systematic, precise and merciless, because it wasn't born of rage. It was born of truth. I hadn't needed to humiliate her with words. I hadn't needed to raise my voice. I had only needed to exist in my power, in the empire she swore I could never build. My husband rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh note that cut through the noise. His face was pale, his lips parted, searching for something to say. The crowd hushed, waiting for his response, for the man who had always stood so firmly in his mother's shadow. Emily. His voice cracked, strained, as if the name itself had become a foreign language on his tongue. I stood still, my chin lifted, my silence louder than his stammering. The spotlight that had once burned me now burned them, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight on my shoulders lift, replaced by the fierce, undeniable truth. I was no longer their burden. I was the fire that had risen from their ashes. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of the wedding spectacle, whispers spread across the city like wildfire. Headlines flooded social media. Socialite's dream wedding exposed. Venue owned by daughter-in-law she publicly scorned. Photos of my mother-in-law's frozen expression, the shards of crystal at her feet, became the image of her downfall. Overnight, the family's carefully constructed reputation cracked under the weight of humiliation. Invitations to charity galas were rescinded. Calls went unanswered. Partnerships dissolved quietly, without explanation. Inside the mansion, silence reigned where once there had been constant chatter. My sister-in-law refused to leave her room, her tears staining silk sheets. My mother-in-law prowled the halls like a caged lioness, her eyes bloodshot, her jewelry stripped away as though even diamonds had abandoned her. She could no longer meet my gaze, but the strangest transformation was my husband. For years he had stood shoulder to shoulder with his mother, letting her voice drown out mine. Now, stripped of her influence, he looked small, almost desperate. One evening, he entered my room without knocking, his tie loosened, his face pale with exhaustion. "Emily," he began, his voice low, pleading, I made mistakes. I should have defended you. I let them." His words stumbled, as if sincerity were a language he had never learned. "But we can fix this. Together. We can rebuild." I watched him carefully, searching his face for something genuine. something more than fear. But behind his trembling voice, I saw the truth. He wasn't mourning our marriage. He was mourning his lost status. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing the power my name now carried. His eyes darted to the contract on my desk, the same contract that had crowned me owner in the eyes of the world. His gaze lingered on the embossed lettering, and I knew then that his plea wasn't born of love. It was born of survival. I said nothing. Instead, I opened a drawer, pulled out a crisp envelope, and slid it across the table. His fingers shook as he reached for it, as if he already knew what it contained. When he unfolded the paper, his face drained of color. Divorce papers. His mouth opened, but no words came. I stood, calm, steady, more powerful in silence than I had ever been in words. For years, he had watched me shrink, diminish, disappear under his family's disdain. Now he saw the woman they had tried to erase, standing before him, unbroken. The next days passed in a haze of confrontation and quiet revelations. My mother-in-law accused me of orchestrating the humiliation, but her voice lacked conviction. She no longer had the stage. The world had turned its back on her, and every attempt at fury sounded like a desperate echo. It was in those quiet hours walking through the hollow corridors of the mansion that the deepest truth sank in. My mother-in-law had been cruel, yes. My sister-in-law had been petty, vindictive. But the sharpest wound came not from them. It came from him. The man who once whispered promises of forever under the stars, who swore to protect me, who let me wither under his mother's shadow because it was easier than standing against her. That was the real betrayal. Not the words of a bitter woman, not the sneers of an insecure sister, but the silence of the man who was supposed to stand beside me. His betrayal was quiet, but it was absolute. I packed my belongings slowly, carefully, not out of haste, but out of certainty. Every folded dress, every closed drawer was a farewell not just to a house, but to a life built on illusions. The marble floors gleamed under the morning sun as I wheeled my suitcase through the foyer. No one tried to stop me. My mother-in-law stood at the top of the staircase, lips pressed thin, powerless. My sister-in-law peeked from behind her door, eyes red with resentment. And my husband, my former partner, stood by the doorway, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, unable to form the words that might tether me to him. I paused, just for a moment, at the threshold. The house loomed behind me, a monument to everything they had tried to make me believe I was not. I thought of the night my mother-in-law whispered, "You'll never make it." And then I stepped forward, the suitcase rolling smoothly across the stone, my back straight, my heart steady. I didn't look back. The silence of the mansion no longer clung to me. For the first time in years, I walked into my own space, an apartment overlooking the city skyline, walls bare, air sharp with possibility. It was not as vast as the estate I had left, nor as dripping in luxury, but it was mine. No eyes watching, no whispered insults, no invisible leash tightening around my throat, just freedom, raw and untamed. Every morning I woke to sunlight streaming through wide windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. And every morning I felt lighter. I poured coffee without waiting for permission. I answered to no one but myself. My phone rang incessantly, investors, journalists, partners eager to know the story of the woman who had turned a family's dream wedding into her stage. I did not chase them. They came to me. But I knew my victory couldn't end at survival. I hadn't endured betrayal, humiliation, and silence just to prove my mother-in-law wrong. My story needed to mean more. So I expanded. The venues I owned, once faceless palaces for the wealthy, transformed. I opened their doors to women who had been told they were too small, too unworthy, too invisible. Spaces once reserved for the elite now hosted conferences for female entrepreneurs, galas for survivors, celebrations for those who had clawed their way back from ashes. My empire became more than profit. It became a symbol. Every chandelier, every marble floor, every stage was a declaration. Power could be built from pain. The first event was intimate. 50 women gathered in one of my halls, their voices trembling at first, then growing stronger as they shared stories of rejection, of betrayal, of survival. I stood among them, not above them, listening. By the third event, the numbers doubled, then tripled. Soon hundreds filled the rooms, their laughter and applause echoing off walls that had once hosted people who sneered at me. Now those walls carried the sound of resilience. The night of our largest event, I stood behind the curtain, my heart thrumming in my chest. The room beyond was alive with anticipation, rows upon rows of women dressed not in jewels for show, but in strength born from scars. The stage manager gave me a nod, and the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. When I stepped onto the stage, the spotlight bathed me in white fire. For a moment, I remembered another spotlight, one that once burned me under the weight of my mother-in-law's disdain. But this light was different. It didn't blind me. It lifted me. Before me, hundreds of women clasped hands, a chain of solidarity that stretched across the hall. Their eyes were on me, not in judgment, but in recognition. I took a breath, steadying myself, and felt the fire rise within. I had broken the game they forced me to play. I had rewritten the rules. And now, I was not standing here to gloat over the ruins of a family's name. I was standing here to build something new. The faces in the crowd blurred into a sea of light. I spoke, not as the woman who had been dismissed, but as the woman who had risen. I spoke of silence, of how it can suffocate or it can sharpen. I spoke of invisibility, of how being unseen can become the greatest power if wielded with patience. I spoke of betrayal and how it can either break you or shape you. And as I spoke, I saw their shoulders straighten, their eyes glisten, their hands tighten in unity. I no longer lived to prove my worth to my husband, his mother, or their gilded circle. They had been chapters in my story, but they were not the ending. My life was not about them anymore. It was about every woman in that room, every voice waiting to be heard, every life waiting to be reclaimed. The applause that followed was not for me alone. It was for all of us. It was the sound of something bigger than vengeance, bigger than survival. It was the sound of rebirth. Later that night, when the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, I lingered on the empty stage. The air was still charged, heavy with echoes of laughter and tears. I closed my eyes, letting the silence settle. And then I whispered, softly but with all the strength I had earned, "They said I'd never make it. That's why I did." The words hung in the air, no longer a defiance but a promise, a legacy.